Yeah, first of all, thank you both for the paper and for the comments. I'm deeply interested in transplants. As you know, you also quoted out an earlier paper of mine. I just have a clarifying question that's maybe more for David than for both of you. In my, you have studied the British Empire in greater detail than I am, but the British Empire has also installed courts all over the empire, right? So even if they didn't codify everything, although there is the Contract Act for India and there is a Patent Act for India in the late 19th century, so there's a lot of stuff that actually did happen and it was made portable through codification for the purpose of export. I'm wondering whether the real export is the judiciary and the kind of legal reasoning and the processes of finding the common law. I studied Chinese law way back when at SOAS, and I took a course on Chinese common law, which was the product of British judges overseeing land disputes in Hong Kong. So I'm just it's a clarifying question, is how little was really transplanted in terms of English law, that we have to define what the law is, but I think for the common law it's the judge, not much more than the statute.
So just briefly, my personal view is exactly what you said. I think that legal culture often transfers, much more easily, whether it's the kind of common law reasoning, litigation, structure of litigation, adversarialism, and so on. Yes, I completely agree with you.
So I'm not wrong in sort of assuming that. So
that's my personal view, but I haven't researched that question in particular, but it's certainly my view.
So I think that in this sense there is a significant difference between the settler colonies and other colonies. In the settler colonies, the judges were taking the law with them to the new settlements, maybe not to the same level of sophistication as it was exercised, let's say, in London, but it was taken by the settlers. Whereas in other types of colonies, the story is somewhat different because it's often executives that come for a short period of time and exercise law in fields they did not know much about without the means, kind of the, let's say, the literary means for doing this. The story of Hong Kong seems not to fit this pattern though, and I think that I should think a bit more about what was exactly going on in Hong Kong. My sense is that in some fields in Hong Kong you had two layers of law, Chinese law for the locals and English law for the English. One more point that I would like to make, which actually I think matches some of your general thoughts about the role of organizational law, is that what scholars are doing is not that important in the fields of organizational law. They touch upon the pathologies, but the real story is not about the pathologies, but rather about the ability to create legal personalities, to separate assets, to create priorities, to prepare yourself for insolvency or whatever. The code of capital that you are discussing is not about courts so much, I think.
Can I just then ask my real question? So I'm just wondering.
So that was not a real question.
Yeah. So basically, just taking your own critique that you articulated, saying, should we just use the European concept and then just map the rest of the world against this? Do they have this? Do they not have it? There's of course an alternative history that you could write. Is what type of organizations that did some kind of business existed in different parts of the world. I'm not surprised that the corporation doesn't operate in a pre-capitalist society. Why should it, right? I mean, so you would have a very different business organization. I'm also thinking about the work by Timur Kuran, who has made the point that, one of the problems of Islamic law was that waqf, however you really pronounce it, never became like a business operation, but just was stuck as a foundation that was not used for business. But So I'm just wondering whether we are missing something if we don't look at the plurality of forms of organization that might not map directly into asset petitioning, etc. Also features that scholars have only reverse engineered into this. Maybe happened, but it's a conceptual move that was made relatively late. And we're missing alternative forms of business organizations that have done maybe a lot of work for the local economy and in those ways.
So in the book on Eurasian trade, that's exactly what I was trying to do. That is to try to see how different regions organize their trade. And for me, this was a natural experiment in the sense that everybody was trying to do something which is not identical, but to some extent similar. They were all being involved in the same type of business activity, maritime trade, long distance, more or less the same goods, often tropical goods, spices, before the industrial age. But this is not a perfect natural experiment in the sense that they are not identically located. Let's say the Indians were at the center of Eurasia, so that the tasks they had to face were different from the English and Dutch that arrived from the very far end of Eurasia. So it's often hard to kind of see whether the same, whether the alternatives are useful because the experiment is not perfect. One more observation. I mean, I could go on telling you about my book project, but that's not the purpose of the conference, I think. So my sense was that as much as I was wandering around Eurasia, the solutions were personally based. That is, cooperation was personally based. That is based on families, extended families, clans, close-knit ethnic groups. Or alternatively, they were based on the coercion of the state. That is, the Chinese state had the ability to coerce by collecting taxes, by drafting people into the Chinese navy, let's say merchant marine navy. I couldn't find alternatives in Eurasia in which collaboration was voluntarily based, in which the personal level of connection was relatively thin. And this is something that I think that the English and the Dutch did. I could see how developments that began in China could reach that stage easily through the various kind of manipulations around the family clan that could own corporate assets and over time was using marriage connections and adoption connections in a manner that was business oriented and planned in advance and things like this. I could see such an alternative that could potentially emerge. If you mentioned Timur Kuran, one could maybe think of how the Waqf could over time change. But the rise of Western Europe kind of blocked these developments, and we could not see the maturity of these developments and could not really compare them.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. That's a fascinating paper, and I realize it's an even more fascinating book that I still have to read both of them properly.
The book is much more fascinating. Unfortunately, for
also for methodological reasons, so I'll certainly look out for it. As to the paper, I have two methodological questions. One that goes to interdisciplinarity and one that goes to institutions. On interdisciplinarity, you write about something that you call the transplant literature, and that you find lacking. And coming from comparative law, it seemed, not willing to defend comparative law as such, but it seemed a very restricted kind of subset of authors that you identify. Maybe not unsurprising given the story that you told earlier of economists borrowing ideas on legal transplants, Laporta, Schleifer, etc. Because they pick specific, they're not lawyers, they pick a specific part of the literature that they think fits them very well. Among them, obviously, Alan Watson in part fits well because it's so easy to identify what gets transplanted there. It's positive law, really. And they plug that into their models. And then everything becomes a reaction to that literature, to that restricted borrowing house. But it seems to me that a number of the things that you say you had to reinvent, or that you found that were ran against the literature, seem to me to exist in some of the literature that we have in transplant. David mentioned the resistance is something that Le Bon focuses on. The actual way in which the transfers happen is, for example, something that Thierry mentioned in actually the conference that was here, I think, and that came out in theoretical inquiry. The recent strand in like European legal history on the entangled histories seems to do a lot on the kind of granular actual type of migration. So on the level of abstraction, at least where you say here that's a gap in the transplant literature, that seemed too short, but short in an interesting way for me, because it comes in a sense from this double translation, first by Schleifer from comparative law into Rechtsdebate, and then for you to some extent from Rechtsdebate into your so that's the first question. One for me also relates to the interrelations between the different disciplines that we're bringing together. And the second, and that draws on the Watson background as well, what do you mean by transplant and the institutions, and what exactly is circulating? So as I said, for Watson, it's clearly kind of specific legal rules. For many others, it's institutions, but institutions still kind of detached from their societal background. Right? So the corporation as an object of exportation that largely gets plugged out from one system and plugged into another one. And other parts of the transplant literature are more concerned about whether there is that object, so to speak, that actually is transplanted, whether what we have is not more a kind of knowledge transfer, ideas diffusion or something like that. But because Timo Kuran was mentioned, Timo Kuran is another one of those, placed a lot of, as a non-lawyer, placed a lot of value on kind of an abstracted institution, like abstracted legal rules in Islamic law, detached from societal background, detached from European imperialism and colonialism, detached from lots of other things, and says the flaw of Islamic development lies in these rules and institutions. So also seems to detach them from everything else there. In the article, in the paper, it seems like what you talk about as the corporation is also something relatively detached from that. I can't check that against the book because I read this on the flight and I didn't have the book with me. But that would be the second question I have, question in the sense of questioning whether there's not something missing in such an analysis, or put differently, whether there aren't, it came out earlier already, some assumptions built into this that you yourself called potentially Eurocentric before, that predetermine some of the other.
Do you want to hear a lot of comments about it?
Yeah, if there are more, yes.
Okay. So, I think Oren is next, and David, and Lisa, and Chris.
Yeah, so
And Barak.
I'll be very brief. This is just a curiosity. So we're talking about sort of different institutions, legal institutions, market institutions, and so I happened to kind of run into this, these large end studies by comparative politics people, and take 150 countries, look at their colonial history, and they actually show that with all the proper caveats, settler, non-settler, and a bunch of other different areas of colonization, or eras of colonization, that you see a significant kind of Britain effect on kind of various democracy indexes of these countries many years after. And so I'm just curious what you think about this. And again, this might be institutions more like courts than actual legal structures, but it seems that there's some there that I'm just wondering why and what the source of the difference might be.
Which political scientists?
I'll need to dig up all
Okay.
these, but there are a few papers that do these argument studies, which I know historians don't like. But,
so very interesting. I like the general thought that you get this kind of diffusion and pluralism. You give a lot of reasons why, in spite of the expectation, you would have kind of diffusion to go. And David added a few more in terms of public choice thing. One more to add, maybe the very normative structure of empire. And you touched on this a little bit when you mentioned the colonies by settlement versus colonies by conquest. Remember, colonies by settlement, the settlers were thought to bring common law with them inherently, whereas colonies by conquest could have a royal governor who sits on top of it. This becomes, of course, a flashpoint in my country in 1774 after the Somerset case banned slavery within the common law, meaning that colonies by settlement were in trouble if they wanted to understand. Put that to one side. Empires are structured as juridical, because if you were to diffuse your law entirely to the subject populations, they're going to start demanding rights. I say this is someone who's soldier who gets into some conflict. If you apply Roman law, you're enfranchising the Sicilian. If you apply Sicilian local customary law, you're denying the Roman his rights. And so they innovated, the praetors innovated a third thing. They use gentium, which they pretend is just sort of a customary law to all peoples that follow that method. And the British don't do that exactly, but the interest in having courts apply local customary or common law and the pluralism that developed seems to me not an accident, but a feature of the empire, precisely so that you can have a sort of interconnection without the sameness of rights that would come if you apply the same legal order. So in that sense, the conclusion you draw that you're going to have trouble in globalization that have the same legal order might not apply as strongly because empire is structured as a juridical equality, whereas something like modern global capitalism might be structured precisely in order to try and get everyone into an equal system in terms of legitimation. To carry these sorts of arguments.
Thank you. I enjoyed this a lot, and I know very little about the content of it, and I have sort of a methodological question, because I was struck that this seems to be very much in the side of context, not concepts. But it sounded like, and maybe that's what you're doing in your books, apologies, I haven't read them, but you're basically identifying various factors which across several cases, but without some kind of determinism, can have either a positive or a negative role. And I was reminded of the kind of model building that other social sciences do, maybe the sort of big M studies, but also in organizational studies and social psychology, where you develop certain hypotheses about potential factors and their mutual influence, and then you try to check them against various case studies. So not model building in this kind of deterministic way that economics often uses, but sort of a looser sense of modeling potentially important factors. And I was wondering whether you're sympathetic to that, or whether there are some systematic reasons why you wouldn't want to do this as I start here.
So my point might follow exactly these two, as well as the earlier conversation with Katrina. So to start where Lisa left is a different way of thinking about the non-transplantation of the business corporation might be that it's a window onto the non-necessity or arbitrariness of the business corporation as a vehicle competing for economic growth. Is to say, it's a story about the pluralism of possibilities for business organizations in different forms in which they will take. One can imagine, maybe families, but maybe also meritocratic systems of organization. That could be a lot of different pluralism of different types of organization possible within capitalism. So one way to think about it is, the functionalism may explain a lot about business corporations, but it may not mean that they're singular, right? That we would look for that function again and again. So I found it interesting to think that way. And then I had some, there was some theme also that David picked up on as I realized I was taken aback by, because I'm not a private law person, I was taken aback by the assumption that we were looking for private law transplantation. Because in the fields that I study, it's more like use gentium, what is public law transplantation. So partly I started thinking that because you start so late about transplantation in the late 19th century, whereas I know your history extends so much earlier. To me, what was transplanted early on by Victoria and other sort of public law theorists was a way of thinking about commerce as rational, secular, right? Sort of thinking about the set of entitlements that would open up markets for the Dutch and the British and the Spanish. So that got me thinking, what happens to the questions you have if you ask them about public law matters? Thinking then about sort of, as I was following my train of thought, a little bit different from what David was saying, but something like the Ottoman Empire, right? The Ottoman Empire, the transplants were not in private law, for that matter, in private law institutions like courts, but in, the law around secular rights, the law around money, the law around capitulary vessels for investment, right? So it was about opening up the space in what I guess I would think of as public law ways that would
that's sort of external and kind of ask, kind of responding to a question with a question. You invited us to say something about the policy relevance, and I actually had a question to you as to, I mean, at page 8 you say that the framework is supposed to serve a dual function, and one of them is policy, and I, while reading it, yeah, I started to think in which way, and I think that some of what you said clarified the way that you think that it can help, and I want to check whether I'm right and whether you really mean that that's what policy should stand for. So it seems to me that you're saying that if it is helpful in the sense of technique for devising means for an end period, so that so that policy is not an argument about what we should do, but rather policy is kind of again a technique of what we should do if we already think that we want to have this specific form of doing it. And kind of implicit in that, you're saying something that was surprising, and some of the discussion made me more surprised by that, is if what you're doing cannot kind of allow us to engage in deeper questions about what should we do, what should our aim be, or rather, what are the possible aims that we can look at, rather than what is the means that we should use once we already took. You see where I'm going, right? So, and especially your comparative, right? The fact that you showed that there are other forms of arranging businesses and trade and stuff, and they have their own trade-offs and their own self, you know, to go back to Roy's paper, so that kind of the wealth of context, I'm going back to Lisa's kind of way of reading you, the wealth of context can allow us to ask actually deeper questions, and it seems that now, and to some extent, here you kind of shallowing what we can, the way that we can employ the insights that you generate.
So I'll just add one thing and give you a few minutes to answer whatever you want with all these things. I think one of the things that comes through in the paper and in the book is that you know, the interest in looking for resistance and the way to think about resistance as to the transplant. They also make us think about who had the impetus to make the transplant. So the you know, sort of base story is this is an efficient organization, so everybody will want it. But then obviously it's not that. There are questions of who might be the leaders and what are the things that create the conditions for either the people who might want the transplant to act, or for the people who might resist to be able to resist. And in some ways, the thing that opens up is how can we look for absences? Because what are the kinds of things that are, you know, sort of before we see actors acting together, what might have happened that prevented it? And one of those places is actually in the alternatives. So if I am about to act in some corporate capacity in a far-off land, is it really to my advantage that I, you know, will be able to act with low transaction costs because the company law is the same there? And one of the big questions is, do I need the law to be local for it to be useful? That is, what are the choice of law rules that make something, you know, useful and necessary? Can I work? What are the workarounds that are available? So this seems very, very difficult to check on the, you know, in the early stages, or in the Eurasian trade book. But actually not as mysterious for the corporation. It seems like in some ways for the later period that those kinds So you can take as much time as you like to answer whatever is
As much time as you like, within the 5 minutes.
Right.
Yeah.
No.
You can take 10 minutes. too.
Yeah, no.
I think everyone has their stamina. We started with-
Even though I allows you to do it. So you raised an array of very interesting and useful comments. One of the alternatives, one of the advantages of kind of accumulating a few questions is that you can be selective and avoid some of the more complicated ones. So I think, Ralph, that you are actually had your finger correctly on the selectiveness of the literature, the legal transplant literature I presented here. You're right. I think that David more or less mentioned some of those other trends in the literature, and you expanded them. The explanation could be the kind of the process of filtering through economists of what's more useful for them, which leaves out those other strands in the legal transplant literature. I'm aware of them. I kind of used some of them in the past. But still, after saying all this, and it's correct that the literature is much more nuanced and much more sensitive to obstacles to transplantation, etc. I think that much of the literature, with a very few exceptions, and there are such exceptions, is looking more into the core fields of private law, be the civil law codification of the Roman, of a Justinian code, or be the core fields of the common law. And the literature pays less attention to some of those components in the law which are fundamental to the functioning of markets. Say organizational law, patent law, maybe bills of exchange law and things like this. So the literature is much richer, but still has some limitations. Another point made, I think, is which kind of I learned to appreciate when I worked on the history of transplantation, is that the level of abstraction of what's being transplanted is very important. That is, and it on the one hand creates methodological problems, because once you borrow some abstract ideas, there are often very little that is remained in terms of traces that you could actually pinpoint for the transplantation. And you can kind of think that very abstract notions, let's say, of profit sharing could be developed independently in different places. One of the ways to pinpoint the transplantation is to get into the minute details and see similarities in the minute details. This would kind of lead you to the conclusion that transplantation was likely, even if you cannot find the actual link. So once you see the migration of abstract ideas, or once you suspect the migration of abstract ideas, it's very hard to prove that this migration actually took place. And I'm still bothered by how to think of the different levels of what was actually transplanted. So I think that I see in the kind of political science, maybe economic history, literature, two types of exercises. One of them is trying to tease out the direction of causality by going back in time. The other is trying to show the stickiness of institutions and the difficulty of getting into a kind of out of these institutions, and this leads to the conclusion that whatever happened centuries ago determines the present in a very strong way. So I'm not sure which of these is the literature that you are referring to. I'd be delighted to look at it, and I find the stickiness literature a bit suspicious, but on the other hand, it's quite solid empirically in some respects. So I'm not sure how to address it, and I would like to get the specific examples and look at them. And so the normative structure of empires. So there is a recent literature that shows that in fact the way in which the British thought about their empire in terms of transatlantic law was bifocal, at least, that is. Some types of laws fit British migrants, and other parts of the empires do not need this type of law, and things like this. But on the other hand, when I look in the second project on capital flows occur around the empire, and in a sense have similar concerns whether you are investing money in settler societies or in crown colonies or in India or in proprietary colonies. The investors would like to have some level of protection of their investments and some ability to appreciate, to capture streams of revenues. So there is this tension between I think the constitutional structure, which is clearly hierarchical, and the capital flows, which are much more, having much more equal effect throughout the empire. And model building, there is much more to be said about model building than I can say now. One of the problems I faced in some of the projects, including here, is what to do with singular events. How do you build a model that would kind of explain a singular event? And in fact, I think that, and many of the most important kind of developments that led to the market economy in Western Europe were singular. Specific lawyers revolution or specific formation of an East India company or whatever. And I think that the exercise in singular events is more hermeneutical. That is, you're trying to give sense, to interpret what you observe in a manner which is not social scientists. Many historians do not use theoretical insights in order to give meaning to such singular events. I think that one should make more use of theory in trying to kind of give some meaning. And I think that when we'll talk about Williamson tomorrow, there are some parallels to be drawn. And so the challenge is how to use theory on singular events. And Chris, kind of the public-private law thing, I mean, for me as someone who works on business corporations, I don't know how to handle this divide between the public and the private law, because in a sense, business corporations move from the one to the other at some historical point, and this is not an abrupt process. It's a gradual process that takes place over, I think, probably more than a century, in which they gradually move from the public constitutional realm into a more contractual private realm with changing theories of which try to explain the nature of legal personality and many other manifestations, let's say, to what extent to apply concepts from trust law or partnership law on corporations, which originally were some sort of maybe governmental agencies or bodies that were created by the crown and were supposed to advance some goals of the crown or of the state. So the public works in a complicated way here. You mentioned the Ottoman Empire. I think that one of the lessons I get is that much of the literature on legal transplants, again, not all of it, is about positive territorial state law. Whereas as you move away from Western Europe to the Habsburg Empire, to the Ottoman Empire and beyond, pluralistic, personally based law is much more common, and then the question, how do you view the interplays within this? And I think that there is often some borrowing of ideas between, let's say, different groups within the same empire, often across religious lines. You can see kind of influence of Islamic law on Jews in Islamic states, influences of Christian law on Islamic law in Islamic states, I think. And Hanoch policy. So you know that there should be, I think, a division of labor in law schools, or at least in the social normative sciences. And Once I dared making a very small move in your direction, you expect me to do so much more, which just caused me to be more reluctant to do even this small step in your direction. So I left the big questions for others to decide and stick to what you might classify as what are the technicalities for achieving an end. I think that others can kind of, whereas if the end should be different, what does it apply to technicalities, etc. We are running behind time, I think. And absences. So when economic historians started doing counterfactual exercises, historians bashed them over doing this, and I think that you are now trying to encourage us to do more such counterfactuals. And how do you do it while maintaining the deep context of things? That's a question that you can maybe do now.